What's up, everybody? This is Karak with ACG, and I figured I would jump on here and talk a little bit about the PlayStation 4 announcement that they did today about the PS4 Pro, what that means for gamers, and what it means as we move forward on an iterative process like this, and what you should expect, I guess, overall from these consoles, especially in the same year like this, where you get an announcement and then boom, it's coming out in November. So the first thing I want to do is discuss a little bit about HDR, because I think that's vital, super important, and something I've talked about multiple times here. You know, HDR really does stretch that difference between light and dark in your movies and in your shows and in your video games, and really does impact the picture in a way that, even with studies as shown, impacts more than the jump from 1080p to 4K. It's actually considered more visually pleasing to go from 1080p to 1080p with HDR from instead of 1080p to 4K without HDR. HDR is a big difference, and it's a pretty cool little magic there, especially because it doesn't really require much more power. It just requires a couple changes here and there. So when it comes to HDR, they did announce that the PS4 Pro at $399 was going to have HDR. Unfortunately, what they didn't announce until after is that it will actually not have a Blu-ray 4K HDR or 4K drive. What does that mean? Well, unfortunately, that actually means that it won't support Blu-ray 4K movies, and that's a pretty big caveat when you look at the Xbox One S for $100 cheaper that actually does so. But ignoring that for a second, we're looking at HDR. HDR allows for games to have more of that dynamic range in its lighting, and unfortunately during this press conference, something went wrong and they didn't show that switch like they said. They said, here it is without HDR and here it is with HDR. As somebody who has HDR capable devices and, understanding what to look for, I wasn't noticing any switch there. I think that that was just completely and utterly a mistake. That does happen during some of these conferences. Additionally, for you folks out there, if you don't have an HDR device or you don't have a 4K device or you're watching on YouTube, there's a really good chance you're going to notice very small, subtle changes at the very most. And that's because basically what these companies are doing is saying, hey, here's something that's coming out soon that only about 25% of you can actually see currently the difference when we do an announcement like this. That kind of stuff happens. One thing I have to take my hat off and say, these guys did a really good job. You know, even Peter Moore a couple weeks ago on IGN in his interview there said that Sony's always been known as a company that likes to employ FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And they love to do that to make people question whatever else is out there and if it will equal whatever Sony's releasing. This conference was spectacularly devoid of any of that, and I really liked it. Now, unfortunately, what that might mean is that some of you who are watching it might have been like, something was missing in this conference. What's missing, to be honest, was a lot of the bullshit. They basically just said, boom, we got something coming in November in the same form factor, and here it is. Now, they were wrong when they said the same form factor. Well, you could say it is and it isn't. It is the same general width and length, but it is actually a full other pancake on top of that PS4 to get the PS4 Pro, which makes sense. They've upscaled the clocks a little bit, and they've roughly doubled that video card power, which I'll get to in a second and what that really means. When it comes to HDR, HDR is huge. As I said, more visually pleasing for many than going from 1080p to 4K. It's a massive, massive improvement, and anything that can do that is going to be great. Now, they did mention a firmware process update for their original PS4s to do that as well. One thing I'm checking into is if that is compatibility HDR or true HDR. Think of it the same way as anytime you ever hear somebody, we're going to upscale or downscale an image, it's never as crisp as the normal native one. Same thing happens with HDR. What you want is true HDR, not a compatibility mode. Though compatibility mode will slightly adjust it, make it look a little bit better, it is nowhere near what true HDR looks like on a TV. So HDR, super exciting. Can't wait to see it. Love that they're doing a firmware update for PS4s. Even if it's compatibility mode, you're getting a little bit of a change there. And then we'll talk a little bit about the power. This is about what you expect in an iterative process. An iterative process is nothing like the 6 to 8 year spans that we see where consoles come out with completely new OSs and new changes to everything. What PlayStation has basically done is this. They've upclocked the CPU and they've doubled the power of the GPU. Now, does that mean that you're going to get double everything? No, you absolutely will not. If that were true, we'd all be on fucking holodecks by now. That never actually works out, or very rarely does, without a ton of optimizations and moving forward, driver updates and fixing this and doing more and more. It's more of a brute force thing, which is why we're not seeing 60 frames per second locked on 30 frames per second games that they were showing. We were actually seeing some of the frame drops that we would expect in those games. That kind of thing is going to be up up to the developer. No game will suddenly just jump, or for the most part, many games will not until they're patched. It would behoove a company, I think, who has a game out that is a locked at 30 or something like that to go back and patch their game. But it's one thing to make sure you understand that this extra power doesn't mean that an old game is suddenly going to have HDR, because it won't. It needs to actually have that in, and it needs to have its source materials prepared for that. Additionally, and even more importantly, for frame rates, you really have to make sure that if a company's got a locked 30, it will not magically get to 60 unless the company goes back and patches those games. So we see an iterative process that is about right. Basically, Sony said, we're not requiring any company to make any changes between a PS4 version and a PS4 Pro version. What does that mean? Well, they tried to show it in the Insomniac video where they said, you know, these guys would be blurry messes far away, and you can see in Spider-Man's suit a crispness to the detail. Not a Christmas, which would be cool anyway, if you do Christmas. So when it comes down to it, what does that mean? Well, that's all true and well and good, but I think one thing that we will see in the future, my hope is that a lot of companies that have some extra space on their DVDs, or I'm sorry, their Blu-rays for the PS4, might release games with texture assets that are a little bit better that the PS4 can read versus the PS4, or the PS4 Pro can read versus the PS4. Will that happen? I don't know, but it is very possible. It is something that they can program in, and it doesn't break the game in any way or break any of the rules that Sony has put forward. You can take those assets and you can have slightly better ones and get them at 4K. Pretty much the same thing that the Xbox S is doing as well with its HDR and with its upscaling. And I think we should talk about upscaling for a second when we talk about all this power. Can they magically get 4K? No, it's just like the Xbox One S doesn't magically get 4K just because it's a smaller system, it's 40% smaller or whatever, and it's got 4K streaming and all that. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't magically make it hit 4K. What they do is they use a scaler and they upscale the image. Now, what does that mean? Well, your TV has one anyway. That's the first thing to remember. So if you buy a 4K TV and you put your normal PS4 into it, most of the time, your HDR device, your TV, will have a scaler of its own. What it does is it goes in, and for every pixel that's at a 1080 image, it copies it to fill in any blanks so that you can get basically a 4K image. Now, some scalers are different than others and do more work on those copied pixels. There are some different scalers that can basically take the difference between the two native pixels and mend them together with some calculations so you get a more gradual, even flow and not just blocky copies. But 4K upscaled still looks really good. We will see how that looks as we move into the future, but I would not expect anybody to assume anything other than really HDR making that, instantly noticeable difference. And that's fine. This is an iterative process. Like I said, it's not that 8-year change. So you've got your HDR and you have your 4K, and you have various different ways in which those are going to be deployed. And then we talked a little bit about VR, and it was a very short snippet, and I think that that's good. That is honestly, I think, Sony holding their cards close to their chest, because they are releasing that VR prior to the PS4 Pro coming out. And so what they want to do is make sure that they just tell you, hey, it'll do some stuff better, but they're not really showing a lot of it. They said, okay, it'll have about double the resolution and stuff like that. And of course, you're taking that larger resolution picture and you're putting it onto the visor anyway. So we'll see some adjustments there. That'll be cool. We'll see some more power on that PS4, Pro version. But hopefully what we'll see is that the PS4 and the PSVR look pretty good on their own. And that the PS4 Pro just allows for, a better looking picture with higher resolution, because already what Sony is doing with their reprojection technology and all this kind of stuff, adding frames could certainly help, but if you had to add frames on your PS4 Pro version, there's a good chance your PS4 normal version of VR game is not at a frame rate that is acceptable. That's one thing I want to make sure people understand is, as somebody who sees unacceptable VR frame rates versus acceptable VR frame rates all the time when I'm doing my testing, it behooves Sony to make sure that their legitimate low-end product, which is the PS4 normal, is able to handle all those VR games, and that the PS4 Pro probably doesn't even add graphical effects other than a higher resolution and then super sampling it down, which can really increase clarity. But you certainly, if you start talking about frame rates, you start, questioning what's the frame rate on the original system and how much does it matter as we move forward to have more frames on something that is apparently adequate already. So you have this system. It's $100 more expensive, It's not bad. It's an iterative process. It's a little bit more powerful. I think what we'll see, especially at around the 4.2, 4.5 teraflops power of this system, we'll see some adjustments to frame rates on games that get patched or games that have an open frame rate. We'll see some adjustments here and there. We're going to see that HDR. Pretty much the same stuff we see on the Xbox One S, except it won't have as much headroom for, true improvements, but we'll still see the 4K upscaling and stuff like that. So right now, we've really got these situations that's quite weird. You have the Xbox One S that's less, $100 less, that actually has the 4K Blu-ray player in it. And then you have the PS4 Pro, which has more power for games, which is very important, but doesn't actually have a Blu-ray in there, a Blu-ray 4K, reader, which to me it seems odd. Like there's a couple issues here, and most likely it was a price situation when it came to the PS4 Pro. They needed to put some hardware in there, so they couldn't get that disc reader in there. But for a lot of people who are moving forward, not just for games but for media, that will most likely end up helping them make that decision, because that's a pretty big deal. I'm fine with it. People have asked me what I think. I get the disappointment, but I think when we're looking at a system like this, it's a system where it's a little bit more powerful. We'll be able to see some of those changes as we move forward. My hope is that, like Microsoft has said, we won't require anybody to make any changes, but I'm assuming both Sony and Microsoft, as we move forward, allow for developers to put more high quality assets in the system, and it can test and go, oh, this is the Xbox One, whatever, Scorpio, or whatever it's really going to be called. And, let's have some higher, resolution meshes, some higher resolution textures. And this is the PS4 Pro. Let's do some of the same thing. There's a pretty big power gulf between the two. We're looking about 2 point some teraflops. If you shrink that down to current PS4 normal and Xbox One normal speeds and teraflops, the difference between the PS4 and the Xbox One is actually quite comparable to what we're going to see with the Xbox One, Scorpio and the PS4 Pro. So that'll be interesting to see if we see a huge difference in the future with those, different resolutions and HDR and stuff like that. So, I like it. I think it's fine. I think that that's a really good price. I think that we can see that some shortcuts were made to get to that price when it comes to the media part of it. But I think that if anybody is out there and doesn't have a PS4, obviously the PS4 Pro is the way to go. For $100 more, you're going to have a little bit more power. You're going to have HDR. You're going to have all that kind of stuff. But again, if you don't have an HDR TV, which is quite expensive, and if you don't have an HDR TV with good input lag, which almost 99.9% of TVs do not, then I am telling you right now, it is best to hold off. That is a huge deal. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can go to artings.com, where they talk about the input lag when HDR is on a TV that supports HDR, and your input lag grows dramatically, sometimes as high as 150 to 200 milliseconds, which is completely it would completely remove you from any kind of, let's say, competitive gameplay and doing as well as you would ever do. That is a huge deal. And as these games or these TVs increase in their technology, we'll see that drop down. But right now, there's only a couple that are very low. We see 30, I think 35 was the lowest I saw, but most are actually in the 80 to 120 range. That's terrible. So you got to understand what you're getting into when you take the move to either one of these new systems. HDR is worth it, but you have to understand that there's only very few actual TVs that are going to support what you want to be able to do, which is play games competitively. And I don't mean competitively just against people. I mean being competitive at hard mode or even normal in, let's say, the next Gears. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, thumbs up. Check out Patreon. Check out Twitter. I'm always on there, always talking. Please follow me. If you dislike the video, give it a thumbs down, and stay tuned, because I'm going to be doing a review on Oriental Empires. I'm going to be doing some coverage on Everspace, and I'm going to be doing some coverage on a really sweet looking RPG called Ember. So anyway, that's it for me. I hope you guys liked the video. If you did, I already said that. Peace out.